Story 1, the room with no number. I had been driving since dawn, weaving along the back roads of the Blue Ridge, the mountains rising up like black teeth on both sides of the highway. My GPS had cut out an hour earlier, and I had been running on stubbornness, pushing deeper into the hills in hopes of finding somewhere to stop for the night. By the time I saw the inn, tucked back behind a patch of leafless oaks, the sun was gone. My headlights caught its wooden siding, grey and curling, and the lanterns that hung by the porch were rusted but faintly glowing. The place looked abandoned at first glance, but the light suggested someone was keeping it alive, if only barely. Inside, the lobby smelled of damp wood and mildew, like rain-soaked books left too long in a basement. The floor creaked under every step. Behind the counter stood an older woman with deep lines in her face, her hair pulled back in a braid. She didn't greet me, not really, just studied me, then reached for a key hanging on the wall. She didn't ask for my name, no credit card, no logbook. Just pressed the tarnished brass key into my palm. The number etched on it was nearly rubbed away, but I thought it looked like a 6 or maybe an 8. I climbed the stairs, the wood railing loose under my hand, and searched the hallway for the door. The first floor of rooms all had numbers painted in faded black, but none matched the key. The carpet was thin, stained, and pulled away from the wall in places. As I walked, I noticed that each room seemed occupied, or had been at some point. Some doors had shoes left outside, as if someone had stepped out briefly. One had a child's toy, an old stuffed rabbit with one button eye, sitting neatly against the frame. Yet I never heard voices, never saw another guest. At the far end of the hall, half hidden in shadow, was a door with no number at all. The knob was dull brass, same as the key. It turned easily. The room was colder than the rest of the inn. It smelled faintly metallic, like old pipes or damp stone. The wallpaper was peeling, water-stained in long streaks down the walls, and when I ran my hand across it, the paper felt almost soft, spongy, as though the plaster beneath was still wet. The curtains hung loose over the window, moth-eaten, swaying slightly, though the glass was closed. The furniture looked older than the rest of the inn. An iron bed frame, a crooked dresser, and a chair that seemed too heavy for such a small room. I set my bag down and sat on the bed, which groaned as though the springs were rusted through. That night I couldn't settle. The silence in the room was too complete. Outside, I expected to hear insects, the hiss of the wind, maybe even traffic in the distance. Instead, it felt sealed, cut off. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps circling my bed. Slow, deliberate steps. The strangest part was that the floorboards didn't creak. I lay still, holding my breath, listening to the sound make its rounds. When I finally worked up the nerve, I turned on the lamp. The room looked different. Subtly, but enough to make my chest tighten. The chair was no longer by the dresser, but closer to the bed, angled toward me. The curtains, which had been hanging loose when I checked in, were now tied neatly in knots. The air felt heavier, pressing down. I searched the corners of the room, the closet, even under the bed. Nothing. I sat up for hours after that, watching the walls. I thought I saw the wallpaper darken as though more water was seeping through, but when I touched it, my hand came away dry. Around 3, I swore I heard breathing. Not mine, but another rhythm, faint and steady, as if someone were pressed against the wall listening. By dawn, I had made up my mind to leave. I shoved my belongings back into my bag, avoiding the chair, and walked quickly down the hallway. The lobby was empty, though the ledger still sat open on the counter, untouched. I waited until the woman appeared from the back room, her braid still damp, as if she had just washed. When I told her which room I'd stayed in, she froze. Her hand tightened on the counter until her knuckles turned white. "You must be mistaken," she said quietly. I shook my head. End of the hall. No number on the door. My key fit. Her face went pale, and for the first time, her voice shook. "That room was bricked shut years ago." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the way she stared past me, not at me, made my skin crawl. I turned to glance up the stairs, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something shift in the shadows there, a pale outline, like the wallpaper itself had taken on a figure. I didn't check out properly. I dropped the key on the counter and left, the door slamming behind me harder than I meant. Outside, the air felt lighter, fresher, though when I looked back at the inn from the road, the windows upstairs seemed dark, every single one. I never drove that way again, but sometimes, when I'm in a hotel and the hallways are too quiet, I catch myself looking for a door without a number, tucked away at the end, waiting, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night. Story 2. The mirror in the parlour. I pulled off the winding mountain road just as the rain started coming down in sheets, hammering the roof of my old pickup with a relentless, drumming rhythm. The headlights caught the shape of a small inn tucked into the trees, its sign swinging loose on rusted chains. I didn't know if it had a name, and honestly, I didn't care. I just needed somewhere dry, somewhere I could rest before trying to navigate the fog-choked roads any further. The porch sagged under the weight of too many seasons, the paint peeling like dried skin. I stepped inside and was met with a wave of damp wood and fire smoke, the scent of a room that had known years without proper ventilation. The common room was dimly lit, only a single fireplace flickering against the far wall, and above it hung the mirror, a massive gilt-framed piece that seemed too sharp, too crisp, almost as if it had been polished in secret to reflect more than just light. It drew my eyes immediately, and I couldn't look away. The room itself was quiet, save for the rain hitting the roof, and a few other travellers scattered at tables, heads bent over mugs of coffee or worn playing cards. Something about that mirror unsettled me. I tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, a trick of the shadows, but even as I sat there, I felt its presence, watching, patient and silent. Hours passed. One by one, the other guests drifted off to their rooms, their chairs scraping softly against the floor before the hall swallowed their footsteps. I lingered by the fire, staring into the mirror. That's when I noticed it. Someone sitting in the corner behind me. The chair was empty when I spun around. No one there. Heart hammering, I forced myself to look back into the glass. The reflection hadn't vanished. A figure sat there, hunched slightly, face obscured by shadows but unmistakably human. It didn't move, didn't breathe, yet it was watching me, patient, silent, waiting. Each time I blinked, its features sharpened, the outline of its face growing clearer, like it was slowly becoming more solid, more real. I tried to rationalize it, told myself the shadows and flickering flames were playing tricks, but deep down, I knew the feeling in my gut was something older than explanation. Later, in my room, I tried to shake it off, rolling over in the narrow bed as the wind rattled the window frames. I glanced down at my compact mirror on the dresser, the one I always carried for small touch-ups, and froze. The surface was cracked, a fine web spreading across the glass. And in that fracture, I swore I saw an eye staring back at me. Not my own, not someone I knew. It blinked once, deliberately, and the hair on the back of my neck stood straight. I turned it over in my hand, hoping the angle had tricked me, but the eye followed, unblinking now, patient, waiting. I didn't sleep. I sat in the bed, knees drawn up, listening to the rain, the house settling, trying to convince myself I was alone. In the hallway outside, I thought I heard soft scraping sounds, like the chair from the common room being dragged slowly across the floor, though I knew that was impossible. The inn was quiet, still, every creak exaggerated in the silence. Morning came sluggishly, a grey wash of light seeping through the curtains. At breakfast, the innkeeper, a woman with hands worn by decades of tending to this place, noticed the look on my face and frowned. I asked her about the mirror in the common room, trying to sound casual, as if asking about a piece of furniture was perfectly ordinary. Her eyes went cold, her lips tightening as she muttered, "That thing was never meant to leave here." I pressed for more, but she shook her head, clearly unwilling or afraid to say another word. I didn't stay another night. I paid for my room without argument, my hands still shaking, and loaded my bag into the truck. Every step out the door felt heavier than it should, as if the air itself was reluctant to let me go. I glanced back once, just over the treetops where the inn crouched like a dark secret among the hills. The mirror was visible through the window of the common room, catching the early light in a way that made it seem alive. I swear I saw that same hunched figure in the corner, sitting, patient, watching, though I knew it should have been empty. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see the inn shrink into the distance normally, but it lingered, unnaturally still, as if refusing to let me leave entirely. And for weeks afterward, I caught myself glancing at mirrors wherever I went, bathrooms, storefronts, even the rear view glass in my truck. And sometimes, just sometimes, I thought I saw something else, something patient, unblinking, hidden behind the reflection of my own face. I don't talk about it much. People laugh or assume it's just the exhaustion of a long drive, a story I'll forget soon, but I haven't forgotten. Not the weight of that gaze, not the quiet certainty in the mirror's corners that someone or something was always waiting. And I know deep down that if I ever went back to that inn, the mirror would still be there and the figure in the corner would still be watching, waiting for the next traveller foolish enough to look too closely, to linger too long. Story 3, The Locked Guest Book. The inn I pulled up to was perched on a ridge, the kind of place that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The wooden siding had faded to a grey that almost matched the fog rolling in from the mountains, and the windows were streaked with rain and dust. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and even the road that led up here seemed unused, grass pushing through cracks in the asphalt. I'd been driving all day, chasing the sun down the ridge, and when I saw the small light glowing faintly through the front window, I felt a strange relief, like I'd stumbled into something human in the middle of the wild. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The lobby had a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years, its grate rusting. On the counter sat a guest book, leather cracked and scuffed, the brass lock hanging at a crooked angle. It looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. I picked it up carefully, running my fingers over the stiff cover, feeling the weight of so many years pressing through. The innkeeper, an older man with tired eyes and rough hands, noticed my interest and said quietly, "That thing hasn't been opened in years. Best leave it be." I nodded, though my curiosity gnawed at me. That night I couldn't sleep. The room was cold, the walls thin, and every sound, rain tapping the roof, a branch scraping the window, kept me on edge. And then I dreamed of the guest book. In the dream, people appeared out of the shadows and bent over it, scribbling their names with a kind of desperate precision. The moment the pen left the page, the writers would vanish, leaving nothing behind but their name. I watched, frozen, as the entries multiplied, spilling across pages faster than possible, dozens of names piling on top of each other. When I woke, I couldn't shake the memory. something compelled me to go downstairs to see the book for myself. I opened the door to the lobby, the boards groaning beneath my feet, and stepped carefully to the counter. The lock was broken, snapped cleanly in two. My heart thudded in my chest. With trembling hands, I lifted the cover and flipped through the pages. Dozens of names filled the lines, all written in different styles, some neat, some jagged, some barely legible. None of them belonged to anyone I had seen in the inn, and then I saw it. My own name, scrawled near the bottom in handwriting that wasn't mine. The date next to it was that very day. I froze, the pen marks on the page seeming to pulse under my gaze. I felt a coldness crawl up my spine. I thought perhaps it was a coincidence, a mistake, a prank, but I hadn't told anyone my full name since I arrived. The innkeeper's presence behind me, quiet and patient, pressed into my awareness. I turned slowly, hoping he might explain, but he only shook his head. "You're mistaken," he said, voice low and unconvincing. "Could be someone else with your name. It happens." I didn't believe him. The room felt smaller, heavier. My eyes kept returning to the page, to the scrawled letters that were unmistakably mine, even if the handwriting wasn't. A strange sensation settled over me, as if the book had somehow reached out and left its mark. A tether I didn't want, but couldn't sever. I closed it quickly, almost slamming it shut, and set it back on the counter. My hands were shaking, and I felt the urge to leave immediately, to get away from the inn, from the ridge, from the book itself. I didn't bother checking out properly. I grabbed my bag and left, the man watching from behind the counter, expression unreadable as I stepped into the fog that had thickened outside. The road beneath my tires felt slippery and uncertain, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the inn dissolve into nothing, or perhaps follow me, though I knew that was absurd. Still, the unease settled deep in my chest, the kind that stays long after the fear has passed. Weeks later, I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that the book had been a coincidence, or the stress of a long drive playing tricks on my mind. But sometimes, when I think about that night, I see the page in my mind, the scrawled letters of my name. I remember the sensation of being watched by something patient and invisible, the weight of the inn pressing down even as I drove miles away. I have never returned to that road, not once. I avoid routes that curve along ridges, inn signs that flicker in fog, the way a shadow might linger just out of reach of light. I don't tell many people about it. Those I have tried to explain it to dismiss it with laughter or polite disbelief. They think it's just a story, a harmless memory of a quiet inn. But I remember the silence in the lobby, the feeling of waiting, of names being claimed by something unseen. The guest book wasn't just a ledger, it was a record, a mark, and somehow, inexplicably, it knew me. I can still feel the ink under my fingertips, the way it seemed to thrum like a heartbeat, as if my presence had been recorded before I even knew I was there. I think about that night sometimes when I'm alone, when a strange noise rattles a window or a shadow falls oddly in a room. I remember the ridge, the fog, and the weight of the pages, and I feel the same hollow dread that gripped me standing in that dim, dusty lobby. And I wonder still if anyone who goes there afterward sees the same thing I did. If the book waits for every traveller, patiently marking names, quietly gathering them like some slow, unseen tide. Even now, I avoid inns tucked away in the mountains, especially those that seem forgotten, those with creaking boards and dust-thick air. I know I can't explain it, can't rationalise the way it felt to see my own name written before I had left a trace of myself. I only know the memory won't fade, that the guest book, and whatever it represents, remains with me, a quiet echo of something I wish I had never found. Story 4, The Attic. that never slept. The storm hit. Just as I was pulling into the inn, sheets of rain hammering my windshield and turning the winding mountain road into a slick, treacherous path. The inn itself was a sprawling, timber-framed building set back from the main road, half hidden by the skeletal outlines of winter trees. Its windows glowed faintly, yellow against the grey of the storm, like a warning or an invitation. I was soaked by the time I reached the porch. The wood slicked beneath my boots, and the door groaned as I pushed inside. The lobby smelled of damp wood and old fire smoke, the kind that lingers long after the hearth has gone cold. There were only a handful of guests, scattered across the chairs and sofas, and the staff moved quietly, almost nervously, as if each step carried a weight they couldn't shake. When I asked about the inn, the young woman at the desk smiled politely, but kept glancing over her shoulder. Her voice was low when she mentioned the attic, almost a whisper. "We don't go up there much. Not since—" She didn't finish the sentence. I asked again, pressing for clarity, but she shrugged and offered nothing more. I thought little of it at the time, dismissing her unease as the odd superstition of mountain folks. I paid for my room and climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, the hallways narrow and dimly lit, carpet threadbare and dust-heavy underfoot. My room was cold but dry, and I shut the door behind me with a dull thud, trying to ignore the way the wind rattled the windows. That night, thunder rolled across the ridge like distant cannon fire, rattling the windows and shaking the floorboards beneath me. Somewhere above, I heard a dragging sound, heavy and deliberate, like furniture being pulled across a wooden floor. I froze, listening, and the noise stopped as abruptly as it had started. My imagination told me it was the old building settling, or perhaps another guest moving about. But the sound repeated, faint and deliberate, each time followed by a long pause that left my nerves raw. I went to the door and listened in the hallway, but no one was there, not a whisper of movement beyond the storm. The next morning, I mentioned it to the innkeeper, a man with a lined face and a sharp tone, expecting perhaps a shrug or a laugh. Instead, he snapped. "The attic's sealed," he said, voice harsh. "No one goes up there. Nothing to hear but the wind. Forget it." I nodded, pretending to understand, but the dissonance between what I'd heard and what he said planted a stubborn doubt in my mind. That evening, curiosity overtook caution. I found the narrow back stairwell that led toward the top of the house, past the kitchen and a closed door marked storage. At the top, there was the attic door, plain, unassuming, with a lock that looked older than the inn itself. I pressed my ear to it, and immediately I heard it. Murmuring voices, low and indistinct, blending together in a rhythm too deliberate to be the wind. They weren't shouting, not quite speaking, just murmuring, almost chanting, layered on one another. I ran my fingers along the knob, locked, rusted solid, and I felt the building itself vibrate as the storm rattled the roof. I left it there, heart hammering, and returned to my room. But sleep offered no relief. Around midnight, I heard a soft scratching, a scraping above the ceiling, followed by a faint plink of dust drifting down. I turned on my flashlight and shone it across the ceiling, the beam catching the falling particles, tiny motes drifting like snow. Each time the noise shifted, I felt it move above my head, deliberate, purposeful. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to convince myself the old roof beams were settling or that water was leaking through the attic boards. But the dragging, the shifting, the low murmuring, all felt alive. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. The storm finally subsided near dawn, leaving only the occasional drip of water from the eaves and a silence that was heavier than the storm itself. I packed quickly, eager to leave, and walked back down the hall to the front door. Outside, the air smelled of wet earth and pine, sweet and sharp after the rain. My truck waited, tyres sinking slightly into the soft gravel. I glanced back at the inn before starting the engine, and something about the roof caught my eye. A sloping peak that should have concealed a modest attic space, but when I looked closer, the slope was solid. No windows, no dormers, no openings. The building was taller than it seemed, but the roof had no room inside. There was no attic. I drove away without looking back again. The memory of that night stayed with me, though. I think about the voices sometimes, the dragging, the dust that fell, as if something above me had shifted. Unseen, I wonder what was up there, why it moved the way it did, why it murmured in that low, layered hum. I can still feel the weight of it in my chest when the wind rattles a window or a floor creaks unexpectedly. I tell few people about it. It sounds absurd when spoken aloud. Voices in an attic that doesn't exist, dust falling from an impossible ceiling. But I know what I heard. The building was old, yes, but it was alive in ways that didn't make sense. And for a moment, it watched me, measured me, perhaps even tested me. Years later, I avoid inns like that one, tucked away along forgotten roads, with timber frames and dark, empty halls. I drive past the ridges and hollows, wary of places that seem too quiet, too still. And every so often, I think I see a peak just like it, just above the tree line, and I feel that same tightening in my chest, that same unshakable dread, wondering if I would hear the whispers again, if I would see the dust drift down from a ceiling that shouldn't exist, if I would ever be able to leave. Even now, when the wind rattles my windows at night, I say, imagine it moving above me, just out of reach, just out of sight, and I can't shake the feeling that the inn, the voices, the shifting are still there, waiting somewhere, patient, unhurried, and very much awake. Story 5, The Inn with Only One. Guessed I had been driving since mid-afternoon, the sky already bruised with storm clouds as I wound my way along a narrow mountain road. My eyes stung from the glare of my headlights on the wet asphalt, and the ache in my shoulders begged for a pause. When I saw the dim, golden glow of a small roadside inn tucked into the ridge, I pulled into the gravel lot with relief. The building was old, timber-framed and sagging slightly, with the kind of weathered charm that suggested it had been there for generations. Rain splashed against the windshield as I approached the door, and the soft hiss of the storm seemed to mute everything else around me. The wooden sign swung gently, squeaking against its iron bracket, but no other sound, no vehicles, no voices, no other cars indicated life beyond the faint light spilling from the windows. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and mothballs, a mixture that made my throat dry. A woman stood behind the front desk. She was older, with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face taut, and a faint smile that never reached her eyes. She handed me a brass key, its number engraved in delicate script. "You're the only guest tonight," she said softly, and I remember feeling a shiver run down my spine despite the warmth of the lobby. Something about the way she said it, so matter-of-fact, almost rehearsed, made the words feel heavier than they should. I nodded, unsure how to respond, and carried my bag to the long hallway that stretched dimly ahead of me. The hall was unnervingly silent. My footsteps echoed against the worn floorboards, but more unsettling were the doors lining either side. Each one had a faint glow beneath the cracks, a yellow light that pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. I paused, listening, and thought I heard a low murmur from behind one of the doors, soft but distinct. A laugh followed, brief and airy, like a child's toy spinning too fast. My stomach tightened. I convinced myself it was the storm's rhythm or my imagination running wild after hours on the road. I unlocked my door, stepping inside, but even then, the whispers lingered, a faint undertone just beyond the walls. That night, I tried to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards, every murmur of laughter made my eyes snap open. I pressed my back against the headboard, listening to the subtle scrape of chairs against floors in the hallway. Occasionally, I thought I could hear the soft shuffle of feet, careful not to alert me, moving past my door. The storm outside masked much of it, but the sound felt deliberate, precise. I wanted to cool down, to confront whoever or whatever was there, but my voice stuck in my throat. Morning came slow and grey. I made my way to the front desk, where the woman was quietly polishing a tarnished bell. I asked her about the noises, the laughter, the rooms that clearly had people inside. Her expression didn't change. She shook her head. "No one's checked in for weeks," she said, her voice calm, almost rehearsed. The weight of her certainty did nothing to calm my nerves. Hesitant, I asked if I could see the registry. She opened a drawer, and there it was, pages of neat, looping handwriting, all blank except for one entry, mine. The date, the exact time of my arrival, and my name in flowing letters that looked nothing like my own scrawl. I left the inn quickly, the sky now a muted grey as the storm began to clear, and I kept glancing back, half expecting to see a flicker of movement at a window. The road stretched endlessly ahead, twisting through the mountains, but my mind kept returning to those faintly glowing doors, to the laughter and whispers that had seemed so intimate, so deliberate. It was impossible, yet undeniable. Weeks later, curiosity gnawed at me. I searched online reviews for the inn, and my stomach sank with each new discovery. Travellers wrote similar accounts. Solitary stays in which they were told they were the only guests, yet each swore they had heard others moving, laughing, talking behind doors, behind walls. Each one described that same uneasy feeling, the sense of being watched, of sharing the space with unseen presences. None of them had stayed more than once, some writing that they had woken screaming in the night, some that they had fled before breakfast, unable to confront the reality of the empty rooms. I tried to reason with it, to tell myself it had been exhaustion, a trick of the mind, the isolation of the road stretching too long into night. But the memory of that soft, deliberate laughter beneath the doors, of voices speaking in tones I could almost understand, has never left me. Even now, driving past that stretch of road, I feel a weight in my chest, a pull to avoid it entirely, as if the inn itself remembers me. The thought of going back is unbearable. The way it sits there, quiet in the shadows, could be anything or anyone. I've told myself it's impossible, that buildings don't whisper, that laughter doesn't echo from empty rooms. But the details, the subtle scrape of furniture, the pulse of light beneath the doors, the registry with only my name, linger too vividly to dismiss. I've driven that road countless times since, always steering clear of the ridge where the inn sits, my hands gripping the wheel a little tighter, my eyes scanning the forest line for signs of what I cannot name. Even the memory of that woman haunts me, the way her smile held nothing behind it, the practiced calm with which she delivered the news that I was the only guest. It's as if she existed only to affirm the impossible, to witness it without acknowledging the horror. I sometimes wonder if she was even human in the sense I understand it, or a part of the inn itself, a sentinel for some unknowable rhythm of isolation and observation. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustles the trees along the ridge, I swear, hear faint echoes of that laughter carried by memory or by the very air itself. It's soft, teasing, and unmistakably deliberate. It reminds me that the world is larger and stranger than I allow myself to admit, that some places exist on a sliver of reality that brushes against something older, something patient. I will never know what I experienced there, but I know I will never forget it. And so I drive past that road when I can, my headlights scanning the blackened edges of the forest, my pulse tightening with the knowledge that some inns are never truly empty and some doors are never truly closed. That night, I was the only guest, yes, but perhaps only in the way a shadow can be alone, yet not alone. I've never gone back, and I never will, because some truths are too uncomfortable to confront, and some experiences linger long after the roads have disappeared behind you. I still dream of the inn, of the glow beneath the doors, of laughter that belongs to no one but the house itself. And when I wake, my heart still races, because I know that somewhere, in some quiet Appalachian ridge, a building waits, patient and silent, for the next traveller to believe they are the only one there. Story 6: The Silent Piano Room. I remember pulling into the Blue Ridge Inn late one October evening, the kind of night where the fog drifts thick and heavy, muffling the road behind your headlights and making every twist of the mountains feel endless. The inn had once been magnificent, I'd read in a brochure tucked into my glove box, but now it leaned into decay, shingles curling on the roof, paint peeling like old bark, and windows dulled with grime. When I entered, the warmth of the small lobby did little to mask the smell of damp wood and age, the scent that clings to a building long abandoned by care. A woman stood behind the desk, thin and pale, her smile polite but measured. She handed me a key with a small metal tag, whispering in that same soft voice, "Room 7. You'll find everything inside." She didn't offer small talk, didn't ask my name beyond what I had already given. There was a subtle wariness in her eyes, as if she expected me to vanish into the shadows the instant I left the lobby. The first night was quiet, in the ordinary way. I unpacked, showered, and ate a meagre dinner in the small dining hall, my footsteps echoing through the empty space. As I wandered back to my room, I noticed the door to the piano room across the hall, chained and locked, its polished black surface catching the dim lamplight and reflecting nothing of the hall beyond. There had been rumours, I'd read later, of this inn once hosting music recitals, the kind that brought travellers from towns across the ridge. But that was decades ago, or so I told myself as I climbed into bed. It was well past midnight when the first note reached my ears. At first, I blamed the wind, or perhaps a trick of the floorboards settling in the cold. The sound was faint, like a single key pressed slowly, lingering in the still air. Then another note followed, soft and deliberate, and another, until it became a slow, methodical rhythm. My heart began to thump against my ribs, not from fear exactly, but from the impossibility of the sound. I knew the innkeeper had said no piano had been played in years. Yet there it was, the echoing touch of fingers across ivory, the vibration crawling through the walls, drawing my attention in a way I could not resist. I tiptoed into the hallway, pressing my ear against the piano room door, expecting to see some trick of sound, perhaps a neighbour tuning a piano somewhere in the building. But the hall was empty, silent except for the muted thrum of the music. I whispered the question that had lodged itself into my throat. "Who's there?" And the note stuttered, like a pause in recognition, then continued, slower this time, as if answering without words. I could hear the faintest creak of the old hinges, as though the door itself sighed with each note. By the second night, sleep had become an impossibility. The music returned, more insistent, echoing through the walls, rising and falling, weaving into something that, sounded less like scales and more like speech. I swear I caught syllables in the rhythm, whispers that circled each other in harmony, a cadence that tugged at the edges of memory. Though I couldn't place the words, my hands shook as I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, a ghost of memory carried in the strain of old wood. But the vibrations beneath the floor were unmistakable. I paced my room, listening, until exhaustion pulled me into a shallow, uneasy sleep. On the third night, I could no longer resist. I left the room with only the lantern I had brought from the lobby and followed the creaking hallway to the piano room. The chain on the door rattled under my trembling hands, but it held firm. I leaned my ear once more, and the whispers came clear. Not music this time, not scales or chords, but voices humming in perfect silent rhythm. Each voice was layered over another, weaving a melody of sounds too low to understand, yet filled with a strange, intimate familiarity. It was like being remembered by something I had never known, a recognition that settled into my chest like a weight. I pressed my palm against the wood, and it felt alive, a subtle pulse vibrating beneath my skin. I spent that night in the doorway, shivering in the cold air that seemed to leak from the room, listening to the impossible harmony of the whispers. My thoughts wandered, unwillingly, to the history of the inn, its grandeur, the travellers who had passed through, the music that had once filled these halls. There was something intimate in the sound, but not comforting. It was a memory that didn't belong to me, but somehow knew me, dragging me into the past in a way I could neither see nor name. Dawn eventually came, pale and grey, and the whispers ceased as abruptly as they had begun, leaving the air heavy with dust and the faint scent of old polish. When the innkeeper appeared to collect my bill, I asked about the piano, about the music, about the whispers I had heard through the walls. She tilted her head and smiled in a way that felt almost rehearsed. "No one has touched that piano in decades," she said. Her voice held no accusation, no disbelief, only a gentle insistence that the past was locked away, though the music I had heard suggested otherwise. I asked if I could see the room, if I could at least verify the piano was real. She nodded, her movements slow, almost careful, and led me to the door. The lock had vanished. The door swung open under my push, revealing the room in its quiet decay. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung from the corners like forgotten drapery, and the piano itself lay broken, keys scattered across the floor, the wood scratched and worn with age. I stepped closer, brushing the debris with my fingers, expecting the music to vanish with the evidence, but I could still feel it under my feet. A vibration that moved through the floorboards as if the notes had embedded themselves in the very structure of the inn. I took a hesitant step back, the pulse of the sound coiling around my ankles, cold and insistent, and for a moment I could not breathe. I checked out that morning before the sun had fully risen, carrying the weight of the inn's silence with me. The road stretched before me, fog thick and unyielding, and I glanced back once, imagining the piano room with its whispered symphony. Weeks later, curiosity drove me to search for the inn online, hoping perhaps to reconcile memory with reality. Reviews were sparse, but each told the same story. Travellers who had been told they were alone, yet who heard other presences in the walls, other notes in the air, fleeting and insistent. None had stayed more than once. None could explain what they heard. Even now, months later, I feel the faint tremor beneath my feet when I close my eyes, the memory of those whispers and broken keys. The inn exists somewhere in the Blue Ridge, a relic of old grandeur, and yet it is a place that will never sleep. I cannot say why the music continued, or why the voices sang beneath the floorboards. All I know is that it did, and that some part of me remains there still, leaning against the door, listening to the silent piano play. Story 7, the guest who checked out twice. I first noticed him the morning I arrived at the inn, a modest, family-run place tucked into a hollow along a winding mountain road in the southern Appalachians. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that makes you feel like you've stepped into a place untouched by time. I had pulled off the road late, exhausted from hours of driving through endless hills and narrow passes, and the inn looked like a refuge. The exterior was weathered, the paint peeling, but there was a warmth in the soft light spilling from the dining room windows. I dropped my bags at the desk, exchanged pleasantries with the innkeeper, a slight, wiry woman with a cautious smile, and took my key. As I wandered toward the dining room to grab a cup of coffee, I noticed him sitting alone in the far corner. He was hunched over his plate, motionless, his gaze fixed downward, and I thought at first that he might be ill. There was something off about him, though I couldn't say exactly what. His suit seemed old-fashioned, the kind of thing you'd see in faded photographs from the 1940s or 50s, and it hung on him like it had been pressed for a funeral decades ago. He didn't eat, didn't sip his coffee, and the occasional blink he gave was slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. The other guests, I assumed they were guests, didn't seem to notice him, though maybe it was just the sort of polite oblivion that happens in small inns. The innkeeper moved around efficiently, topping off cups and clearing plates, but never once approached his table. My own curiosity made me glance back at him several times during breakfast, and each time he sat in the same rigid posture, staring at nothing. And I got the uncanny sense that he wasn't merely alone in the room. He was somehow outside of it, a fixture that had always belonged there. The rest of my stay was marked by that quiet unease. The inn itself was small, the rooms worn but clean, and the hum of the old heating system kept the hallways in a near-constant murmur. I noticed that staff interactions were oddly limited, their smiles polite but fleeting, their eyes glancing at the corners of the room as if half expecting something to happen. And through it all, that man remained in his corner. Each morning he was there, each evening he was there, never speaking, never moving except to lift a fork or adjust a napkin. The inn had a sense of stasis, like a painting you could walk into, and he was at the heart of it. On my last morning, I couldn't resist asking about him. Over steaming coffee in the dining room, I approached the innkeeper, who froze mid-pour, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the pot. "You saw him?" she asked, voice tight, almost a whisper. My confusion must have shown, because she motioned for me to follow her back to the front desk. She pulled open a drawer and produced the guest ledger, its pages yellowed and soft with age. My eyes traced the lines, scanning the neat, looping script of names, dates, and notes, and there it was, his name, written twice. Once decades ago, with a departure date matching the entry made just last week, the day I had arrived. I blinked at her, trying to make sense of it. "But he's here now," I stammered, glancing back toward the dining room. The innkeeper's face had gone pale, almost grey, and she shook her head. "No," she said softly. He's not here." Hesitantly, I followed her gaze across the room, and my stomach dropped. The chair he had occupied so rigidly, so unwaveringly, all the mornings I had spent drinking coffee and stealing glances, was empty. Dust had settled thickly on the cushion, undisturbed, as if no one had ever sat there at all. I could feel the prickle of dread creeping up my spine, the sudden cold that seemed out of place in the warm sunlight streaming through the windows. I asked more questions, though I didn't expect answers. The innkeeper murmured about strange stories, whispers passed down over generations of families who had run the place before her. She spoke of the old ledger, of names that seemed to return, of guests who had arrived for a night and then vanished from memory, though the record stubbornly insisted they had existed. Each story she shared seemed half-formed, hesitant, like a warning too delicate to fully voice. She avoided eye contact when she spoke of him, almost as though acknowledging him might invite something beyond comprehension. The drive away from the inn was tense, a silence punctuated only by the hum of tires on the pavement and the occasional rattle of loose cargo in the trunk. I couldn't shake the memory of that chair, the stillness of the man who had not really been there, the ledger that confirmed him as both ancient and recent at once. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched online for the inn, thinking maybe some other travelers might have noticed something unusual. What I found was disturbing in a way that made my stomach knot. Reviews by other visitors were scattered over years, each account eerily similar. Several mentioned the same man, or a man like him, sitting silently, always observing, never acknowledged by staff or other guests. Each review noted the ledger, each confirmed that the man's name appeared long before their visit, and yet there he was, existing somehow in their presence. None of the reviewers had stayed longer than one night. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence, a trick of memory and imagination amplified by the isolation of the mountains. The inn's isolation was real enough. There were no neighbours, no nearby towns, just the winding, narrow roads and the thick Appalachian forests that seemed to close in on the inn as night fell. Yet I could not forget the rigidity of that man's posture, the stillness that seemed to resist the passage of time, and the cold, subtle weight of a presence that had no right to exist. Even now, months later, when I close my eyes at night, I see the outline of him in the corner of a dining room, bathed in pale morning light, and I feel the dust settle on a chair that should have been empty. It is the memory of that dust that haunts me most, the quiet accumulation of years, undisturbed, unclaimed, yet somehow marking the impossibility of what I had witnessed. I can still picture the soft glint of sunlight across the edges of the ledger, the careful script of his name, repeated like a ghostly signature bridging decades. The more I try to rationalize it, the more elusive the answers become. The innkeeper's voice, the faint tremor in her hands, the way she looked at me as if I had glimpsed something no one else should ever see. They all linger in my mind, threading unease through the otherwise ordinary memory of travel. I think often about why he would appear that way, in that place, at that time, and I know I never will have a complete answer. Some nights, when the wind is sharp and the trees scrape against the roof, I hear a faint echo of a chair being nudged across a floor, a muted scrape that might just be my imagination, or might be him, returning in a rhythm that defies logic, appearing for a night only to vanish again. The Appalachian roads are full of stories like this, whispered by those who notice oddities and shadows, by those who travel alone and feel the weight of something unseen, something lingering beyond explanation. I no longer drive past that stretch of mountains, but the memory persists, a quiet, unyielding presence like the man himself, sitting, waiting, unnoticed by everyone, yet somehow undeniably real. Even now, I sometimes wonder if he watches still, not just from that dining room corner, but from wherever the ledger holds him, tethered to the world by ink, paper, and the faint persistence of a presence that should not exist. And I cannot escape the fear that if I ever return, he will be waiting again, as he has waited for decades, an impossible guest who has checked out long before he ever arrived, leaving behind only dust, a chair, and the unshakable sense of something impossibly wrong. Story 8, The Lantern on the Hillside. I had arrived at the inn just as the sun was sinking behind the Blue Ridge, the fog rolling in thick and slow, swallowing the valley in a grey, trembling hush. The inn itself was a weathered thing, a family-run place with sagging porches and creaking floors, but I had chosen it for the isolation. I wanted a few nights of quiet, away from the noise of the city, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until it becomes almost tangible. That first evening, after a dinner of beans and cornbread that left the taste of iron on my tongue, I climbed the narrow stairs to my room overlooking the western ridge. The window framed the hills like a living painting, fog curling over ridges, twisting in the dying light. It was beautiful, but there was something in the way the mist shifted that pricked at my skin, a subtle, almost imperceptible awareness of being watched. Around 10 o'clock, when the last of the staff had retired and the inn had gone quiet, save for the occasional groan of old timber, I noticed it. A faint glow on the hillside just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was the lantern of another traveller, someone hiking late or lost, though I couldn't see a figure. The light swayed gently, like it was suspended on a breeze, and for a moment I felt comforted. But then it stopped. Right there, on a ridge, directly across from my window, the lantern bobbed almost lazily, and I had the unmistakable feeling it was looking at me. My stomach tightened. I wanted to close the curtains, pull the blinds tight, and pretend I hadn't seen it, but something rooted me to the floor. The next morning, over breakfast, I mentioned it to the innkeeper, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and fingers that trembled ever so slightly as he poured coffee. He paused mid-motion, eyes flicking to the window as if recalling some distant memory, before shaking his head slowly. "Don't look at it," he said, voice low and rough like gravel. "It's best not to." I laughed nervously, assuming he was referring to some local superstition, a story told to tourists to make the place seem quaint, but there was no amusement in his eyes, only that hollow, warning kind of seriousness that made my chest ache with unease. That evening, the lantern returned. I saw it almost immediately from my window. It moved more purposefully now, up the slope, slow and deliberate, swaying as it climbed. My pulse quickened. I thought about heading downstairs, about asking the innkeeper again, but the thought of leaving the room, of crossing the hall, made my hands shake. I watched as the lantern halted once more, this time lower on the ridge, closer to the edge where the trees cut into the fog. It seemed to sway with a rhythm, almost deliberate, like it was trying to draw my attention. I couldn't look away, couldn't blink, couldn't convince myself it was anything ordinary. By the third night, the lantern was closer, almost on the edge of the field directly below my window. I could see the faint outline of a figure holding it, but details were impossible to make out through the rolling grey. I lay in bed, staring, heart hammering, feeling my breath catch in my throat. Something was off. The movements were too measured, too controlled, and the swaying didn't match any natural motion I knew. I remember thinking I could hear faint, almost imperceptible murmurs, but when I strained my ears, it would vanish, leaving only the wind and the distant call of an owl. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that light bobbing slowly toward me. The fourth night was worse. I had begun to notice a pattern. The lantern would appear just after 10, always stopping for a moment, then inching closer each night. I thought about leaving, but something in me, the same instinct that makes you freeze when you hear the snap of a branch behind you in the woods, kept me glued to the window. That night, the lantern seemed almost at my window, the glow pressing through the glass, even though the curtains were drawn. I could feel the warmth of it, faint but insistent, like a hand hovering inches from my skin. Panic rose in my chest, clawing at my ribs. I wanted to shout, to run downstairs, to demand answers, but the fear pinned me to the floor. The innkeeper found me there at some point, or maybe I simply drifted to sleep in a haze of dread. When I awoke, it was nearly dawn. The fog had thickened and the ridge was gone, swallowed entirely by the pale grey mist. Relief washed over me in slow, cautious waves. I had survived the night, whatever it had been. I ate a quick breakfast and packed my things, insisting to myself I'd leave before nightfall. The innkeeper didn't question me. He merely nodded, pale, his eyes carrying the same warning they had the night I arrived. I didn't sleep that last night, too afraid to glance out at the ridges, too haunted by the memory of that light pressing close, too aware of something just beyond sight. When I finally drove away, the fog clinging to the valleys like smoke, I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination, the inn itself playing tricks on me. But then, as the road curved and the hills opened behind me, I saw them. Dozens of lanterns, bobbing in unison across the ridge, distant but unmistakable, moving like some slow, silent procession. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles went white, but the sight didn't change, didn't disperse. And for a moment I felt as though the very hills themselves were alive, watching, waiting. Even now, months later, I can't forget the way the light swayed. I lie awake at night in my city apartment, and I swear I can see it through the blinds, faintly bobbing across the skyline, impossible and stubborn. Friends tell me it was just fog, a lantern from some late hiker, maybe the tricks of an overtired mind. But I know what I saw. I know the way it moved. I know the deliberate, impossible closeness of it, and the way it felt like it had been following me from that first night until the last. The innkeeper's words echo in my head, a warning I didn't heed. Don't look at it. But how do you not look at something when it wants you to? When it presses against your senses so slowly, deliberately, that your own curiosity becomes your captivity. The hills of the Blue Ridge are beautiful, yes, but in that beauty is a weight, a presence that lingers in the fog and the wind, in the spaces between trees, in the quiet of a room when no one is awake. I can still feel it sometimes, faintly, in the vibration of the air, the tremor of some unnameable thing watching, just beyond sight. I never went back to that inn, never even drove near the ridge again. But the memory follows me, slow and insistent, like the bobbing of lanterns on a foggy hillside. And every once in a while, when I'm alone at night and the city is quiet enough to hear myself think, I swear I can see them through the haze. Tiny bobbing lights, countless in number, pressing closer, unblinking, patient, and impossible to escape.